I grew up on that ranch, and to me, it wasn't just a piece of land. It was a heartbeat of my entire childhood. The ranch stretched for miles under the wide Texas sky, a mix of rolling fields, oak groves, and a creek that cut the back pasture like a silver ribbon. My father had worked every inch of that soil before me, and I took over after he passed, determined to keep the place alive, to keep his memory alive. Life out there wasn't always easy, but it was honest, and that's what I loved most. I married young, and my wife loved the land as much as I did. We had 2 boys, both still in grade school when I got my orders. I'd been serving in the Army Reserve for years, and when I was called up for a deployment overseas, I didn't think twice. Serving was my duty, but I'll admit, leaving that ranch was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I arranged everything carefully before I left. Property taxes were paid, fences were repaired, cattle had been sold off to lighten my wife's load, and we had a local caretaker to keep an eye on things. I figured it would be hard on the kids and hard on my wife, but we'd get through it just like we always did. What I didn't know was that while I was halfway across the world, fighting in a country most Americans couldn't even find on a map, a group of busybodies in an HOA boardroom were scheming over my land like vultures circling a wounded animal. The first letter my wife got was polite enough. Something about community improvement plans and an invitation to join the local Homeowners Association. We didn't even live in a subdivision. We were out on county land, so she laughed it off and threw it away. But then came another letter, this one more formal, talking about unpaid dues and threats of lien enforcement. My wife was confused, but she didn't tell me right away. She didn't want to add stress to my deployment. Instead, she went down to the county office herself and tried to get to the bottom of it. The clerk told her there was some newly formed HOA that had annexed several parcels of land, including ours, and they claimed we owed back dues for community maintenance. Imagine that. Maintenance for roads we didn't use, parks we never saw, and a pool we didn't even have access to. She told them there had to be some mistake. But they were persistent, even aggressive. Before long, she was getting visits from strangers, men in polos and clipboards, telling her we needed to comply with community guidelines about our fencing, our livestock, even the color of our barn. She told them to leave, that they had no authority here. But they just smirked and said, "You'll find out soon enough." I didn't hear about any of this until halfway through my deployment, when she sent me an email that sounded more worried than usual. She said things were getting serious, that they'd filed some sort of lien against our property, and she was scared they might try to foreclose. I wanted to jump on the next plane home, but I still had months left in country, and we were in the middle of operations that wouldn't allow for leave. I told her to call a lawyer, and she did, but the lawyer warned her it could take months, maybe years, to sort out, and in the meantime, they could proceed with sheriff's sale if they convinced a judge they were owed money. She was furious. I was furious, but there wasn't much we could do from where we were. I promised her we'd fight it the second I got home, but those HOA people were fast. Too fast. The day I got the news, I had just come back from patrol. Dust still covered my uniform, and I sat on the edge of my cot, boots unlaced, when a Red Cross message came through. At first, I thought something had happened to my family, but it was worse than that in a different way. My wife told me through tears that the property had been sold at auction. Sold. My ranch. My father's land. Gone. She said they showed up with papers, sheriff's deputies and all, and told her she had 30 days to vacate. 30 days to pack up everything we owned and leave the only home our boys had ever known. She begged them to let her stay, begged them to reconsider, but they just shrugged and said it was out of their hands. She called the lawyer again, and he told her that while he could fight it, we'd have to do it from a position of weakness now, because legally, the land had transferred. I sat there in that sweltering tent, staring at the dirt floor, feeling like someone had reached inside my chest and ripped my heart out. I'll never forget the day my deployment ended. The plane landed, and all I could think about was getting back to Texas, back to my wife and kids, back to what little was left of our life. But when I drove up to where our ranch used to be, I didn't recognize it. The fences were gone, the barn had been painted over, and there were foundations being poured, slabs for new houses, a whole row of them. Some developer, in bed with that HOA, had wasted no time turning my home into a construction site. My boys just stared out the truck window, confused, asking me why other people were living on our land. My wife sat beside me, silent, her face pale, her hands clenched in her lap. I swore right then, and there that I would make it right. I didn't know how, but I knew I wasn't going to let a bunch of smug HOA board members erase my family's history without a fight. The first thing I did after that drive was head straight to the county courthouse. I wanted to see the paperwork for myself, to hold it in my hands and understand how anyone could take a man's land while he was serving his country. The clerk, a middle-aged woman who looked like she'd seen too much bureaucracy for one lifetime, pulled up the file. I watched her expression shift from neutral to guilty as she read through it. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, "but it looks like a judge signed off on foreclosure. The lien was enforced." I asked her how much the lien was for, bracing for the answer, and nearly laughed when she said the number out loud. Less than $4,000. $4,000. For that paltry amount, they had taken my entire ranch, hundreds of acres, worth more than $1 million on the open market. I leaned against the counter, trying to keep my temper in check, my knuckles white as I gripped the edge of the form she'd printed for me. I asked her who had bought the property, and she told me it had been sold to an HOA-affiliated development company at auction for pennies on the dollar. That was the first moment I felt something cold settle inside me. Not grief, not despair, but anger, a kind of slow-burning fury that felt like it might never go out. That same afternoon, I drove to the so-called HOA office. It was a prefab building stuck between a strip mall nail salon and a dry cleaner, with a cheap vinyl banner hanging over the door that said, Oakwood Community Association. I parked my truck right in front of their entrance, marched inside still wearing my boots and fatigues, and asked to speak to whoever was in charge. A young receptionist with too bright lipstick blinked at me nervously and said the board wasn't in session today. I told her I wasn't asking about a meeting. I was demanding to talk to whoever had signed off on stealing my land. Eventually, a man in a golf shirt came out, the kind of man who looked like he'd never had dirt under his fingernails a day in his life. He introduced himself as the HOA president and tried to give me some kind of speech about community standards and unpaid obligations. I cut him off and told him I'd been serving overseas when all of this went down, that they had no right to take what they took, and that they had 30 days to undo it before I came back with lawyers. He smirked, that same smug little smile my wife had told me about, and said, "You'd be surprised how much power a Homeowners Association has, soldier. You might want to get used to the idea that this isn't your land anymore." Something about the way he said soldier made my blood run hot. He said like an insult, like my service meant nothing to him. I stepped in closer until we were almost nose to nose and told him that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The receptionist gasped, and the man flinched but tried to keep his composure. "Threats won't get you anywhere," he said. I turned on my heel and left, but not before telling him I'd see him in court. By the time I got home that night, I'd already called every lawyer I could find who specialized in property law. Most of them were hesitant. Some even admitted that fighting an HOA could be an uphill battle, especially since a foreclosure had technically been legal. But I found one attorney, an older veteran himself, who told me we might have a chance. If they violated the Service Member Civil Relief Act, he said, we can nail them to the wall. They can't just foreclose on active duty service members without following a very strict process. If they skip a step, we can get the whole sale reversed. That was the first glimmer of hope I'd had in months. We filed suit almost immediately, naming the HOA, the development company, and even the county for allowing the sale to go through. The case made local news, which only seemed to make the HOA dig in their heels more. They hired their own lawyers, big city types who thought they could intimidate me with paperwork and jargon. But I'd faced worse than them overseas, and every time I stepped into that courtroom, I reminded myself that I wasn't just fighting for a piece of dirt. I was fighting for my family, for my father's memory, for every soldier who'd ever had someone back home try to take advantage of them while they were away. My wife stood by me through every hearing, every deposition, every night when we came home exhausted from another round of legal wrangling. We stayed with my brother during that time, crammed into his farmhouse with our boys, living out of boxes while strangers built houses on the land that should have been ours. The turning point came when my lawyer uncovered internal emails from the HOA board. Apparently, one of their own members had grown uneasy about what they'd done and handed over copies of their correspondence. Those emails showed that they had known about my deployment and had proceeded with the foreclosure anyway, hoping I wouldn't find out until it was too late. Worse, they colluded with the developer to fast-track construction so that by the time I got back, the land would be unrecognizable, making it harder to fight for. That piece of evidence changed everything. My lawyer contacted the Army's Legal Affairs Office, and soon JAG was involved. The Army doesn't take kindly to people preying on deployed soldiers, and once they had the facts, they threw their weight behind my case. Suddenly, this wasn't just a civil dispute, it was a federal matter, and the Department of Justice started looking into it. Word spread fast. Reporters started calling. Other service members came forward with similar stories about being targeted by HOAs while they were deployed. It turned into a public relations nightmare for the board, but they still refused to back down. Instead, they doubled security around construction site, as if I was some kind of criminal who might sabotage the work. I didn't need to lift a finger. My fight was in the courtroom, and I knew that as long as I had the truth on my side, I had a chance. Still, I won't pretend it didn't tear me up inside every time I drove past my old property and saw bulldozers ripping up the pasture where I used to ride with my kids, or concrete trucks pouring driveways where my father's barn once stood. That land had been my anchor my whole life, and watching it get carved up into cookie-cutter lots felt like watching someone vandalize a family grave. It didn't take long for the presence of the Army JAG and the Department of Justice to turn my case from a local dispute into a story that got national attention. Within a few weeks, I was sitting across from reporters on local TV stations, telling my story, not because I wanted the spotlight, but because I wanted everyone to know what had been done to me and my family while I was overseas serving my country. The public's reaction was swift. Veterans groups started contacting me, offering their support, some even offering legal funding if I needed it. Military families from all over sent letters, emails, and messages of encouragement. What had started as my private battle was becoming a rallying cry for everyone who'd ever been wronged by a Homeowners Association. And that's when I noticed a shift. The smug looks disappeared from the faces of the HOA board members when we met in court. They weren't so cocky anymore, not with the media camped outside the courthouse steps and veterans standing shoulder to shoulder with me in the gallery. The developer tried to distance himself from the HOA once the federal investigation started. Their lawyer claimed that they had acted in good faith and relied on the validity of the lien. But those internal emails my lawyer had dug up showed they'd been anything but innocent. One message in particular became the smoking gun. It was from the HOA president to the developer, boasting about how quickly they'd be able to flip my property and how much profit they'd make before I even got back from deployment. By the time he gets home, this whole place will be a neighborhood. The email read, "We'll be untouchable." The judge didn't like that at all. He granted us a temporary injunction, halting further construction until the case was resolved. I can't describe the relief I felt that day, knowing at least for now, no more houses would go up on what was left of my land. But the battle was far from over. The HOA hired a public relations firm to try to spin the story, painting me as uncooperative and claiming I refused to pay reasonable dues that benefit the community. It was laughable, and it backfired spectacularly. Every time they went on the news to smear me, more veterans came forward with their own horror stories, and more people rallied to my side. Before long, the HOA's meetings were swarmed with angry residents demanding answers, not just about my case, but about how their dues were being used. One meeting turned into such a shouting match that the sheriff had to be called to keep order. Board members started resigning one by one, unwilling to face the mounting backlash. It was like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion, and though I tried to keep my emotions in check, I won't lie, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. Meanwhile, my attorney was building a rock-solid case. He brought in experts to testify about property valuation, proving that what the HOA had done was not only predatory, but wildly disproportionate. For $1,000 in alleged unpaid dues leading to the seizure of land worth over $1 million, the judge called it grossly unjust during one hearing, and you could see the HOA's lawyer squirm. Then came the federal angle. My status as an active duty soldier. Under the Service Member Civil Relief Act, what they'd done wasn't just a civil violation. It was potentially a federal crime. That's when the U.S. Attorney's Office got involved, opening a criminal investigation into the foreclosure process, the lien filings, and even the county officials who had rubber-stamped it all. It was no longer just about getting my land back. It was about holding people accountable. I started getting calls from people I never thought I'd hear from, congressmen, state senators, even generals who wanted to know the details of what had happened. "We take care of our own," one of them told me, and they meant it. A task force was assembled, not just to address my situation, but to review every foreclosure that HOA had conducted in the last 5 years. It turned out mine wasn't the only one that looked suspicious. There were at least 3 other families who had lost their homes under questionable circumstances, and they were now part of the lawsuit too. We had strength in numbers, and the court case snowballed from a single complaint into a class action suit. Despite all this progress, I couldn't let my guard down. Every time I drove past a land, I saw what had already been taken. 3 houses fully built and sold, families already living in them, kids playing in yards that used to be my pasture. I didn't blame those families. They didn't know they were buying stolen land. But it was hard not to feel a knot in my stomach every time I saw them. My boys were having a hard time too. They missed the ranch, the wide open space, the creek where they used to catch tadpoles. Now they were stuck in my brother's spare room, asking me every night when we were going home. I told them we would, eventually, that we just had to be patient. But patience is hard to ask for when you're a kid, and everything you love has been taken from you. The Army's support was unwavering. When my commanding officer found out about the case, he called me into his office and told me to take as much time as I needed to see it through. "You're fighting another kind of war now," he said, "and we've got your 6. That meant more to me than I can explain. It wasn't just about one man's fight anymore. It was about sending a message to every HOA, every predatory developer, every bureaucrat who thought they could steamroll over service members and get away with it. We were going to show them that some lines couldn't be crossed without consequences. The day of the final hearing felt like walking into battle. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, cameras, veterans in their unit ball caps, neighbors who had quietly rooted for me, even a few county officials who looked like they were praying they wouldn't be named next in the investigation. My wife sat beside me, her hand gripping mine so tightly I could feel her nails in my skin, and for the first time since I come home, I felt like we might actually be at the end of this nightmare. The HOA's legal team showed up in full force, expensive suits and briefcases polished enough to see your reflection in. The developer's representative sat 2 rows back, his face pale and tight, as if he knew what was coming. And front and center sat the U.S. attorney, representing not just me, but every deployed service member whose rights had ever been violated. My lawyer presented our case with the calm precision of a man who had done this 100 times before. He walked the court through the timeline. The formation of the HOA, the annexation of my property without consent, the bogus dues, the lien, the foreclosure, and finally, the sale to the developer. Then he introduced the emails, the ones that showed they had known about my deployment and gone ahead with their plan anyway. This was not an innocent mistake, he told the judge. This was a calculated scheme to strip a soldier of his home while he was serving his country, in direct violation of federal law. He paused for effect and added, "And if they can do it to him, they can do it to anyone." You could have heard a pin drop in that courtroom. The HOA's lawyer tried to argue that they had followed proper procedure, that notices had been sent, that they were simply enforcing their bylaws. But when the judge asked them to explain how a $4,000 lien justified seizing property worth over $1 million, they stumbled. Worse for them, the DOJ had brought in a witness from the Army JAG office who testified that the Service Member Civil Relief Act explicitly forbids foreclosure on active duty personnel without a court order, and the HOA had never obtained one. The judge's face darkened as he listened, and by the time the testimony was done, it was clear which way the wind was blowing. Then came the most powerful moment of the entire trial. My wife took the stand. She told the court about the day the deputies came to the ranch, how our boys had cried as they watched strangers tack eviction notices to the front door, how she had begged for more time and been laughed at. She held up one of the letters the HOA had sent and read it aloud, her voice shaking but strong. "This isn't just about money," she said. "This is about what they took from my family, from my children, from my husband while he was putting his life on the line overseas." There wasn't a dry eye in the room, not even mine, though I tried to hold it back. When she stepped down, I could see the jurors looking at her with something between pity and righteous anger. The verdict didn't take long. The judge ruled the foreclosure null and void, declared the lien illegal, and ordered that title to property be restored to me immediately. But he didn't stop there. He also ordered the HOA and the developer to compensate me for damages, enough to cover every legal bill. Every month we've been forced to live elsewhere, and then some. The total was enough to make their attorney blanch. But the hammer still hadn't fully dropped. At the request of the DOJ, the court referred the matter for criminal prosecution under federal law. That meant the HOA president and several board members were facing charges that could land them behind bars. The reaction outside the courthouse was like something out of a movie. The crowd erupted in cheers when we walked down the steps, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. Veterans slapped me on the back. Neighbors hugged my wife, and my boys were grinning ear to ear. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe again. But the story didn't end there. Over the next few weeks, federal investigators continued to dig, uncovering more shady dealings by the HOA and the developer. Several county officials quietly retired before they could be subpoenaed, and a grand jury handed down indictments against the entire HOA board for conspiracy and fraud. That's when the Army stepped in for real. It turned out I wasn't the only soldier they targeted. There were others in other neighborhoods who had been hit the same way. The Army used my case as a precedent and started coordinating with federal agencies to protect service members' property rights nationwide. A memo went out to every JAG office in the country, instructing them to monitor foreclosures involving deployed personnel and intervene if necessary. What had started as one man's fight was turning into a national policy shift. Back on the ground, the fallout for the HOA was catastrophic. Residents who had once supported the board now turned on them completely. Lawsuits piled up, meetings were canceled because no one would show up, and eventually, the association was dissolved entirely by court order. The developer pulled out of the project, abandoning half-finished homes, and leaving behind a mess of concrete slabs and empty lots. The county tried to auction them off to cover their legal costs, but no one wanted them, not after what had happened. The land sat quiet again, waiting for me to decide what to do with it. For a while, I just stood on the edge of the property, looking out over the fields, remembering what it used to be. The barn was gone, the fences torn down, but the land itself was still there, still mine. I promised myself and my family that we would rebuild, that the ranch would rise again even stronger than before. But this time, I wouldn't just rebuild fences and barns. I'd build something that would stand as a reminder that no one could take what was ours again. The weeks that followed the verdict were some of the busiest of my life. Restoring title to my name was just the beginning. There was still the matter of undoing everything that had been built while the case was pending. 3 houses were already standing, sold to unsuspecting buyers, and several more were in various stages of construction. At first, I didn't know what would happen to those homeowners, and honestly, I felt torn. They weren't the villains in this story. They were families, just like mine, who thought they were buying homes fair and square. But the federal government handled that piece with precision. The U.S. Attorney's Office offered relocation packages and full refunds to each family, paid for by the HOA's insurance and the developer's assets that had been frozen by the court. One by one, the families packed up and left, and when the last moving truck drove away, my land was mine again, fully and completely. The Army didn't just stop at helping me. They made sure every wronged service member in the region got justice. There was a day I'll never forget when a convoy of military trucks rolled up to my property, not for war, but to help tear down what never should have been built. Engineers from the Corps of Engineers supervised the dismantling of the 3 homes, salvaging what materials they could. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about restoring what had been taken. The sight of those uniforms working side by side with civilian crews was something out of a movie. Neighbors gathered to watch, cheering when the first house came down. The Army took back every house, someone said, and it stuck. That phrase ended up on headlines across the country. What had happened here became a warning to every HOA and developer who thought they could prey on deployed service members. Try it, and the Army will come knocking. My boys were there the whole time, sitting on the hood of my truck, watching as our land slowly became a ranch again. When the last house was gone and the last concrete slab hauled off, I took them walking to the pasture, showing them where we'd rebuild the barn, where the cattle would graze again, where we'd put up a new fence line. My wife held my hand the whole way, smiling for the first time in months, and I realized that even though we'd lost so much, we'd gained something too, a sense of strength we didn't know we had, a community of people who had rallied behind us, and the knowledge that we'd stood up to something bigger than ourselves and won. Rebuilding took time. We put up new fences first, then started on the barn. Friends and neighbors pitched in, and what could have taken a year took only a few months. The local feed store donated lumber, a nearby rancher loaned me equipment, and a veterans group that supported me during the trial came out on weekends to help pour concrete and set posts. By the time spring rolled around, the ranch looked like itself again, better, even. We bought a small herd of cattle, just enough to get started. And the first time I saw them grazing under the sunset, I felt like my father was there with me, nodding his approval. But the biggest change wasn't the land. It was to me. Before all this happened, I thought I knew what it meant to fight. But that was always in uniform, always in faraway places against enemies I could see. This fight had been different. This fight had been about my home, my family, my life. And it taught me that sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with rifles or in deserts. They're fought in courtrooms, in county offices, in the hearts of the people you love. When it was all over, I promised my wife and kids that no one would ever take us by surprise again. I put protections in place, hired a property manager to watch over things when I was away, and even ran for a position on the county commission to make sure no other family would go through what we had. The HOA board members eventually stood trial. Most of them took plea deals, admitting to fraud and conspiracy, and a few even served jail time. The president, the smug man in the golf shirt who once told me to get used to the idea this isn't your land anymore, was sentenced to several years in federal prison. The developer filed for bankruptcy, his empire crumbling under the weight of lawsuits. It wasn't just justice, it was accountability. And though I don't spend my time gloating, I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a sense of closure seeing them held responsible. Months later, when everything was rebuilt, I threw a big barbecue on the ranch. Everyone who had helped us, friends, neighbors, veterans, even some of the lawyers, came out. We grilled steaks. Kids ran to the fields, and for the first time in years, laughter echoed across the property. As the sun went down, I stood by the fence, looking out over the land, and felt an overwhelming sense of peace. This ranch had nearly been taken from me. But in the end, it had been returned, stronger than ever. And now, every time I see my boys running to the pasture or my wife sitting on the porch with a glass of sweet tea, I remember why I fought so hard. The land wasn't just dirt and grass. It was freedom. And freedom, I'd learned, is something worth fighting for no matter where the battle takes you.